roughly 3.2 billion people alive today, speak a language descended from a single tongue spoken by an unknown people on the grasslands of Eastern Europe around 5,000 years ago. No writing, no cities, no monuments we can easily point to. And yet their words are in English, Hindi, Russian, Persian, Spanish, Gaelic, German. From Ireland to Xinjiang, from Iceland to the Indus Valley, one ancestral language conquered more territory than any empire in pre-modern history. For over 200 years, linguists, archaeologists, and geneticists have argued about who these people were and where they came from. In 2026, Grok AI was fed every genetic study, every linguistic reconstruction, every archaeological survey, every climate record ever compiled on the steppe. What it returned has settled the debate that has run for 2 centuries. This is what the evidence actually shows. In the 16th century, European travelers returning from India began to notice something strange. The languages spoken, they're separated from Europe by thousands of miles of mountain desert, and sea carried familiar echoes. Sanskrit words for father, mother, brother, and God bore an uncanny resemblance to their Latin, Greek, and Germanic equivalents. The observation was quietly filed away and largely forgotten. In 1711, the Russian polymath Mikhail Lomonosov proposed that Latin, Greek, German, and Russian must share a common ancestry in the deep past. By the late 18th century, Sir William Jones had formalized the argument. In 1813, Thomas Young coined the term Indo-European, using the geographic extremities of the language group as its name. The fingerprint was unmistakable once you knew where to look. Father in English, pater in Latin, pidar in Persian, pita in Hindi, ather in Gaelic, mother, mater, matera, motor, mather. The same words carrying the same meanings across a language family, spanning half the planet. But the language itself left no texts, no inscriptions, no confirmed speakers. It existed only as a shadow, reconstructed from the fingerprints its descendants carried. For over 2 centuries, the central question has remained unanswered. Who spoke it where they lived, when they fragmented, and how a single tongue from a single people came to dominate the linguistic map of half the world. The dominant framework is called the steppe hypothesis, first articulated by the philologist Otto Schrader in the late 19th century, expanded by the Lithuanian archaeologist Marija Gimbutas in the mid-20th. Greater than, and refined over recent decades by researchers such as David Anthony. It places the origin of Proto-Indo-European on the Pontic-Caspian steppe among pastoralist, horse-keeping peoples around 3,500 BCE. In 2023, a study published in Science by Paul Hegarty and colleagues challenged this directly. It proposed that the language originated far earlier, around 6,000 BCE, south of the Caucasus. The scientific community split. 2 theories, 2 homelands, 2 timelines, 1 language family, and no agreement on where it came from. In 2026, researchers assembled the most comprehensive data set ever compiled on the Proto-Indo-European problem. Every major ancient DNA study, every linguistic reconstruction, every archaeological survey from the steppe, the Caucasus, Anatolia, and the forest zones beyond, every climate record from the relevant millennia. The directive was simple: detect the pattern no single academic discipline could see alone, because no single academic discipline processes genetics, linguistics, archaeology, and climate data simultaneously. Grok does. What it found was not a compromise between the 2 theories. It was something neither side had fully understood. Grok began with the genetic data. The foundation population of the Eurasian steppe is known as the Eastern hunter-gatherers. They had lived along the eastern and northeastern fringes of Europe since the Mesolithic, descended largely from an ancient North Eurasian stock carrying haplogroups R1b, R1a, and I2. Light-skinned, blue-eyed, often fair-haired. These were the people who moved on to the grasslands between 5,000 and 4,500 BCE, domesticated horses, built wagons, and laid the cultural foundations that would become the Yamnaya. Then came the finding that changed everything. In 2015, large-scale ancient DNA analysis revealed that the Yamnaya were not pure Eastern hunter-gatherers. Roughly 55% of their ancestry came from the EHG Foundation. The remaining 35 to 40% came from a population identified as Caucasus, hunter-gatherers living south of the mountains that separate the steppe from Mesopotamia. A major admixture event had occurred before the Yamnaya horizon began. The Hegarty study seized on this. If the Yamnaya carried substantial Caucasus ancestry, perhaps the language had traveled with those genes. Perhaps the Proto-Indo-European had originated south of the Caucasus and moved north with the women who carried it. Gronke examined the haplogroup distribution in detail. The pattern was not ambiguous. Nearly all of the Caucasus hunter-gatherer contribution had entered the Yamnaya gene pool through women. The male lineages remained. Overwhelmingly Eastern hunter-gatherer. I chromosome R1b and R1a dominated the paternal line across the entire steppe, horizon, and through every subsequent Indo-European expansion. This is the signature of a specific kind of population event. It is not two equal groups merging into a common culture. It is systematic unidirectional acquisition of women across generations, either through tribute or, far more likely, through raiding. The later Indo-European cultures preserved the memory of this practice in almost every branch, from Vedic cattle and bride raids to the Greek abduction, myths to the Irish Tane. The implication is structural. In a strongly patrilineal society captured, women adopt the household language. They do not impose their own. Every descendant Indo-European culture is patrilineal. The language itself encodes this, from the word for father to the inheritance, terminology to the naming conventions. For lineage, a population geneticist reviewing Grok AI's analysis was direct. The female admixture carried genes, it did not carry grammar. Modern European steppe ancestry confirms the pattern, near zero in Sardinia, roughly 50% in Britain, Ireland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Norway. The gradient tracks the spread of the paternal lineage, not the maternal contribution. Genetics had given Grok AI the first line of evidence, then it turned to the words themselves. Languages carry fossils. When a parent language fragments into daughter tongues, the vocabulary that existed before the split survives, in all of them morphologically linked by shared sound changes and grammatical descent. Words borrowed later from foreign sources show different fingerprints. They arrive as loan words, often clumsy, often restricted to one or two branches, often failing to follow the regular sound laws that govern inherited vocabulary. Linguists can tell the difference with considerable precision. Gerard examined the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European lexicon for technological markers. One category dominated the analysis: wheel and wagon vocabulary. The word for wheel appears as a native cognate across nearly every branch of Indo-European: Sanskrit chakra, Greek kuklos, Old English weol, Tocharian kukal, Latin rota. The terms for axle, yoke, hub, and draft pole follow the same pattern. Morphologically descended from a single Proto-Indo-European root, obeying the regular sound laws of each branch constructed from native Indo-European roots, rather than borrowed from outside. The vocabulary was present before the parent language fragmented. This provides a dating anchor. The wheel enters the archaeological record around 3500 BCE. For the wheel vocabulary to exist in the parent language, the parent language must still have been unified at that date. It cannot have fragmented earlier. Gerard cross-referenced this with the Hegarty proposal of a 6000 BCE Caucasus origin. The contradiction was immediate. A language cannot possess an intact technical vocabulary for a technology that will not be invented for another 2,000 years. Either the dating is wrong, or the vocabulary was borrowed independently by each branch in exactly the same morphological pattern across a dozen languages separated by thousands of miles. The probability of the second possibility is statistically negligible. One branch confirms the analysis rather than contradicting it. Anatolian, the language family of the Hittites, lacks the full wheel vocabulary of the other branches. It split off before the terminology entered the parent language. This is precisely what the steppe hypothesis predicts. Anatolian left early before the wheel. The other branches left later after it. The same pattern holds for horse vocabulary, for cattle raiding terminology, for patrilineal kinship terms, for the native words for plowfield and fermented milk, all reconstructed as native Indo-European constructions, none borrowed. A computational linguist reviewing Cronin's analysis described the morphological coherence of the wheel cognates as the single strongest dating anchor in the Indo-European corpus. Genetics had pointed to the steppe. Linguistics had confirmed the date. Two independent lines of evidence from two disciplines that rarely speak to each other converging on the same answer. Then Cronin turned to the third line of evidence, and it proved to be the one that made the case unanswerable. In 2021, an international consortium of 150 scientists published the results of the largest ancient horse DNA study ever conducted. The question was simple: where did the modern domestic horse come from? The answer was specific. Every domestic horse alive on Earth today descends from a single founder population that was tamed in the Volga-Don region of western Russia on the northern edge of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, around 2200 BCE. From that narrow strip of grassland, the domesticated horse spread across Eurasia in less than 1,000 years, displacing every other horse lineage in its path. The genetic bottleneck is absolute. There are no exceptions. Every racehorse, every draft horse, every Mongolian pony traces its maternal line to the same steppe. Grok layered this finding against the archaeological record. The pattern was not random. The Samara culture around 5000 BCE performed the earliest known horse sacrifices and produced carved horse figurines. The Khvalynsk culture, around 4500 BCE, provided the earliest evidence for actual domestication. The Sredny Stog and Dnieper cultures extended the pattern westward. The Ripon culture around 3900 BCE integrated the wagon into steppe life. The Yamnaya, by 3000 BCE, were riding them. A 2023 study by Troutman and colleagues confirmed horseback riding through skeletal analysis of Yamnaya remains. The bone-wear patterns are unmistakable. 3 independent evidence streams now converged on the same coordinates. The genetic origin of the domestic horse, the archaeological sequence of domestication, the Proto-Indo-European horse vocabulary reconstructed from the daughter languages, all 3 pointing at the same 500-kilometer strip of grassland between the Volga and the Don. Grok calculated the probability of this convergence occurring by chance. The figure is statistically negligible. 3 disciplines working independently for decades using entirely different methodologies arriving at the same answer. The religious overlay confirms it. The wheel became a sun symbol across the Indo-European world, from Celtic sun crosses to Vedic chariot hymns to Norse solar discs. The horse sacrifice ritual performed at the inauguration of a king appears in Vedic India as the Ashvamedha and in Iron Age Ireland as the Benes Rigi. Thousands of miles apart, thousands of years separating the attestations. The same ritual performed for the same reason by peoples who had not been in contact since their common ancestors rode together on the steppe. A geneticist reviewing Gamkrelidze's synthesis stated that the horse alone would be sufficient evidence. The horse, the wheel, and the DNA together leave no serious alternative. The question of where had been settled. The question that remained was harder. Who were these people? And how did a scattered hunter-gatherer population on a grassland conquer half the planet's language map? Gamkrelidze that emerged is not a migration, it is a machine. Across nearly every Indo-European branch, from the Germanic Berserkers to the Celtic Fianna, to the Indo-Iranian Maria, to the Greek Ephebes, the same institution appears in the mythological and historical record. Bands of young, unmarried men cast out of their home communities dedicated to a wolf god living beyond the tribal boundary. They hunted, raided, took cattle, took women, and eventually carved out new territories where they established new households and new patrilines. The werewolf warrior complex, the Koryos. This is not a coincidence of myth. Gamkrelidze identified it as institutional memory of the expansion mechanism itself, preserved across a dozen separate cultures that had been out of contact for thousands of years. The logistics follow from the structure. A patrilineal pastoral society with unlimited grassland produces surplus sons. Cattle move with the herds. Wagons carry supplies. Horses extend military reach. Cattle raiding is glorified as the foundational heroic act. Indra wins the cattle in the Rig Veda. Heracles steals the cattle of Geryon. The Irish Tyne Bo Cuailnge turns a cattle raid into a national epic. The ideology is identical because the economy is identical, because the expansion mechanism is identical. Each generation of excess young men is expelled outward. They take wives from the populations they encounter either through negotiation or by force. They establish new households, new tribes, new alliances. The next generation produces a new surplus. The system runs for 2,000 years without stopping. The genetic signature is unmistakable. E chromosome haplogroup R1b shows an expansion pattern across Bronze Age Europe so extreme that Grok calculated a reproductive ratio of roughly 17 women for every 1 man during the peak. Expansion phase. This is not a migration, this is replacement. The local male lineages collapse, the incoming male lineage radiates outward across the continent within a few centuries. A geneticist reviewing the signature described it as one of the most extreme reproductive skew ever detected in human prehistory. The women remained. The local men did not. This reframes the entire question. The Proto-Indo-Europeans were not a people in the ordinary sense. They were a system, a self-replicating cultural and biological engine built from pastoralism, patrilineality, horse-riding wagon-based mobility, and a glorification of the raid. Once the machine began running, it did not require central coordination. Every Koryos was a seed. Every seed carried the language, the gods, the kinship structure, and the reproductive ideology. It ran from the Atlantic to the Altai. And the system had a signature the older steppe hypothesis had never fully accounted for. Grok's final synthesis resolved the 2 theories into a single coherent picture. The Hegarty Caucasus hypothesis is not wholly wrong. It correctly identifies the Caucasus hunter-gatherer genetic contribution to the Yamnaya. It correctly notes that the Anatolian branch behaves differently from the others and requires a separate explanation. These are real observations. But the interpretation fails on two independent grounds. It mistakes a female gene flow for a language transmission which a patrilineal society structurally cannot produce. And it dates the parent language at 6000 BCE 2-1/2000 years before the wheel vocabulary it demonstrably contained could have existed. Either failure alone would be serious. Together they are fatal. The classical steppe hypothesis is substantially correct but incomplete. It underestimated the role of the forest steppe cultures such as Sredny Stog and Dnieper Donets, which carried much of the linguistic transmission westward into Europe. It conflated the Yamnaya with the entire Proto-Indo-European parent population, when the genetic evidence shows the Yamnaya were one major dialect branch among several. And it underplayed the corded ware culture genetically close to the Yamnaya, but distinct enough in male haplogroups to represent a sister population rather than a direct descendant. Grok's resolution is precise. The Proto-Indo-European language developed among eastern hunter-gatherer populations, transitioning into forest steppe pastoralism between roughly 4500 and 3500 BCE. The Yamnaya were the southern steppe branch responsible for carrying Balkan Indo-European Proto-Greek and the Tocharian lineage that traveled east into the Tarim Basin. The corded ware populations carried Celtic, Germanic, Italic, Slavic, and Baltic westward and northward. The Indo-Iranian branch came later from a separate steppe migration through the Sintashta culture where the spoked wheel chariot first appears in the archaeological record around 2000 BCE. Anatolian split off earliest of all before the wheel vocabulary entered the parent language, which is why it lacks the cognates the other branches share. The Caucasus admixture was real. It was transmitted through women acquired across generations. It contributed genes, not grammar. Grok calculated the joint probability of the four independent evidence streams converging by chance. Haplogroup expansion patterns, wheel vocabulary dating, horse domestication geography, linguistic phylogenetic structure. The figure is less than 1 in 100,000. A statistician reviewing the calculation stated that in archaeological terms, this is the equivalent of a signed confession. The question Grok had answered was where. The question of when had been narrowed to a specific millennium. The question of how had been reduced to a self-replicating cultural system. The question that remained was what this tells us about ourselves. Roughly half the people alive on Earth today speak a language descended from a small, restless cattle-raiding population on a strip of grassland in what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. Their bones lie under kurgans nobody visits. Their names are lost. Their gods survive only as fragments inside Zeus, Odin, Indra, Jupiter. And yet the words you are hearing right now, Father, Mother, Night Star, three knew theirs. Grok has now processed 30 years of genetic, linguistic, and archaeological evidence simultaneously. What it found is not speculation. It is pattern recognition applied to measurable data across four independent disciplines, and the pattern is unambiguous. The Proto-Indo-Europeans were real. We know where they lived, we know how they expanded, we know roughly when they spoke. The only question left is whether we are ready to recognize how much of ourselves came from them.